We begin today the Gemara on Daf Mem Zayin, right at the beginning of the Amud. The Gemara continues here the halachas regarding the Shtei Alechem that is brought on Shavuos together with the two kvasim, the two lambs that are ashlamim. Tana Rabbanon, so we learned on Abraise, Kivsei Atzeres, the two lambs that are brought on Shavuos, Ein Mekatchen Es Alechem Ela B'Shchita. They do not sanctify the breads only from the time of when they're slaughtered. Now what this means is these breads that are designated for the Shtei Alechem to be part of this carbon, until the time of the Shechita, the level of sanctity that it has is what's called the sanctity of Trumas Halishka. It was bought with the funds of the Machzah Shekel. It has Kedushas Damim, a sanctity of its value. But there's no sanctity in the actual body of its existence. But when you shecht the lambs for the Shtei Alechem, then it gets that Kedushas Haguf, the sanctity in its body, like a carbon. The Gemara will soon bring the pasuk as a source for this. Now, Ketzad, what does this mean? Shachtan l'shman, if it was shechted properly for the sake of the shlamim. V'zarak daman l'shman, and then later the blood was sprayed also for the proper sake of the carbon. Kiddush alechem, this sanctifies the bread. Shachtan shalei l'shman, however, if it was shechted not for the sake of this shlamim, of the kivsiyat tzeres, and v'zarak daman shalei l'shman, and the blood was sprayed not for its sake, then like kiddush alechem. The bread does not get sanctified with Kedushas Haguf, it remains Kedushas Damim, as I explained. Now, Shachtan L'Shman, if he did shecht the Kivsiyat Tzeres L'Shma, but V'zarak Daman Shalei L'Shman, but the blood of this carbon was sprayed Shalei L'Shma. So then Halechem Kodesh, the bread becomes sanctified, but Ve'ena Kodesh, it's not completely sanctified. Divrei Rabbi, this is Rabbi's opinion. And the Gemara will soon explain what this means, yes Kodesh and not Kodesh. Rabbi Shimon argues and says, L'olam ein kadosh, the Shtei Alechem do not become sanctified, the Kedushas Haguf, ad sheyishchayit l'shman ve'yizrek daman l'shman, until you shechted the carbon for its sake, and then also sprayed the blood properly l'shma. Only then does the status of the bread change to become a Kedushas Haguf like a carbon. Okay, so the Gemara brings the sources to explain the reason of Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon. My time of the Rebbe, what's Rebbe's reasoning? That it's a shchita, that's makadesh, the bread, the chsiv, because the pasuk says by a nazir, ves ha'ayil yasa zevach shlamim, lashem, al salamatzes. That you take a ram and you make it as a zevach. The term zevach always means to slaughter, the shchita, a shlamim, for the basket of matzes. So just like there we see by the ayil of the nazir, it uses the term zevach, which is the shechting, and then that's when the sal hamatzos, it's for the sake of, and that's when it sanctifies the sal hamatzos. So we say similar here regarding the Shtei Alechem and the lambs that are shechted, that it's the shchita that is mekadesh the bread. Says the Gemara, lememre, the shchita mekadesh. So this term teaches that it's the shchita that sanctifies the bread. But Rabbi Shimon argues in this pasuk itself, it says yasa. It doesn't only say the term zevach, but it says yaseh, which means an additional action that you do. And that's at sheyaseh kol asiyasav. That the matzah is there by the nazir, and similarly here by the Shtei Alechem does not get sanctified only by the shchita, but you have to do everything until its completion, which includes the zrika of the dam. So the Gemara explains, Rebbe Nami, now according to Rebbe, haksiv yaseh. It doesn't only say the term zevach, but it says yaseh. So why does he say that the shchita alone is makadesh? Answers the Gemara, iksiv zevach yaseh. If the order in the words of the pasuk would be first zevach, which means to shecht, and then yaseh, that means additional actions afterwards, kidikamrit. Then, like you are arguing, like Rabbi Shimon says, would be true that you need also the zrika of the dam to be mekadesh to Shtei Alechem. However, hashted chsiv yaseh zevach. Now that it says you make it a zevach, which means slaughter, shchita. So that means, Bameh Yasa Bezricha. How does it become in its status to be fully Kaddish Kedushas Haguf? That's only with the shechting itself. Now, the Gemara asks the reverse, according to Rabbi Elazar Shimon, Haksiv Zevach. It says in the pasuk the term Zevach, if the pasuk wants to say that you have to complete the Asiyah until the Zrike for the bread to get sanctified, why does it use the term Zvicha referring to the Shchita? That term of zvicha teaches what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yochanan said, Hakol moedim, everybody agrees, that it has to be the bread It has to be there at the time of the slaughtering. You can't bring the bread later on. You have the bread already before. And then it only becomes Kaddish, though, at the time of the Zrika. So therefore the Torah says the term of Zevach, that you have to have the bread already designated at the time of Shechita, and then Yaseh, that only by the Zrika it becomes fully sanctified. Now the Gemara returns to explain what Rebbe said regarding the case where the Shechita was done Lishma, but the Zrika was done Shaloi Lishma. So Rebbe says that it's Kaddish ve'enei Kaddish. What does this mean? So the Gemara, my Kaddish ve'enei Kaddish, what does this expression mean that Rebbe is saying? So Abaye explains that it means Kaddish but ve'enei Gomer. It did become sanctified, but not completely. To some extent, it still has a status of its previous Kedusha, which is only Kedusha's Trumas Alishka of its value and not in the Guf itself. The Gemara will soon explain what this means, what the relevance of this is. Abaye says no different. Or, sorry, we just read what Abaye said. Rava Amar, that is, Rava says, Kadosh ve'enoi nitar. It becomes sanctified by the Shechita alone. However, it's not going to be permitted to eat from this bread, because the Zrika is the matter. And if the Zrika was done Shalei L'Shma, you cannot eat from this bread. But otherwise, it becomes completely Kaddish, according to Rebbe, by the Shechita alone. Says the Gemara, my benayu, what is really the difference between what Abaye is saying and what Rav is saying? Because certainly Abaye agrees to the point that Rav said that you can't eat from this bread, because if you don't have the Zrika done properly L'Shma, it's not matter to eat then from the bread. So everybody agrees to that point. So what relevance is there to what Abaye says, that it has Kedusha, but it's not Gomer, it's incomplete? And says the Gemara, the difference is, L'mitfas pidyaynai. When it comes to redeeming this bread, if you would want to deconsecrate this bread on other monies, whether or how this Kedusha takes effect now on this monies. Now here, there are two pshatim in Rashi, two gerses in the Gemara, and we'll start with the first pshat that Rashi brings, which is the gersa that we have in our Gemara. La Abaye, according to Abaye's opinion, that said that it's not yet fully Kaddish, meaning it has somewhat of these new Kedusha in its body, Kedusha Saguf, but it also still has a certain status of the Kedusha before, the Kedusha of just money, Kedusha's Domim, the Trumas Alishka Kedusha, that status still remains somewhat. What's the relevance of that? So for Abaye, the relevance for that is that La Abaye loy tofis pidyaynai. The status of this bread being shtei alechem, if you're going to deconsecrate it on something else, on money, it's not going to get the status of shtei alechem. It's going to get the status of whatever, any kedusha. You'll be able to then use this money to buy any carbon with it. Why? Since according to Abaye, it's not yet fully Kaddish as Kedusha Saguf, as a carbon of Shtei Alechem, there's still something in it which has a Kedusha of before, of just being the money belonging to Trumas Alishka. So when you deconsecrate it, that status of being Bechlal Kedusha of Trumas Alishka will be what will take effect on the money that you are deconsecrating it on. That's according to Abaye. However, L'Rave, according to Rave, that says that according to Rebbe, when you shecht it, when you shecht the kvasim, that is, now the breads become completely kaddish, kedusha sagov, so tafis pidyaynai. If you're going to redeem it, then it'll take effect on what you redeem to be completely the status of shtei alechem. That money is going to have on it the kedusha and the status of shtei alechem to be used only for this and not for anything else. This is the gersa that we have here in our Gemara and the first pshat in Rashi. However, in the second pshat, Rashi says that the rule is as follows. When it comes to something which is kaddish, only kedushas domim, the value of it, that could be deconsecrated. However, something which has kedushas aguf, like a carbon, that its body is already kaddish, it can't be deconsecrated unless it has a mum. So over here, how could you say that according to Abaye that says that it already has a kedushas aguf on it, that Abaye would be the one to say that in the girsa of our Gemara, again, Abaye says that it still has a kedusha from before, from the Trumas Alishka, and Abaye says on that loy tafis pidyaynai, that the pidyon would not take effect. Why would it not take effect if, according to Abaye, it still has the kedusha from before? In other words, Rashi says it sounds like the Gemara is trying to say that the argument here between Abaye and Rave in these terms of loy tafis pidyaynai and tafis pidyaynai is related to this subject. Is it already Kedushas Agov and therefore you can't deconsecrate it? Or is it still only Kedushas Damim and you could deconsecrate it? So if that's the case, then you have to be guided in the Gemara and learn the pshat here, the opposite. And therefore, in the second pshat in Rashi, and this is the pshat that Rashi accepts, he says you have to read in the Gemara that le'abaye tofis pidyainai. According to Abaye's opinion, since there's still a leftover of the previous status of its kedusha being just in its value and not the kedusha of the golf, so it's that aspect of kedusha that you have the ability to deconsecrate and not to bring the kedusha to be teifis and something else. However, l'Rava loy tofis pidyainai. According to Rava, here we're going to loy tofis pidyainai, since Rava says that it's completely kaddish b'kedushas hagof at the time of Shechita, so if you want to try to deconsecrate it now, you can't, because this is the rule by something which is Kaddish, Kedushas Agov, there's no pidyon that takes effect at all. This is the Gersa that Rashi accepts. However, for the first pshat of Rashi, so the reason why, even though it's Kedushas Agov, it would be possible to deconsecrate it, is because it wasn't placed yet in a vessel, in a klisharis, and therefore it would be possible to deconsecrate it according to that pshat in Rashi. Okay, we'll continue the Gemara. We'll continue according to the second shot of Rashi. Says the Gemara, it's understood according to what Rava says, that according to Rebbe, it has a full kedusha at the time of Shechita. So Haine de Ikke bein Rebbe le Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon. So we understand what the difference between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon is. That according to Rebbe, since it has full kedusha, so there's no pidyon. According to Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, only by the Zerikas Adam it gets Kedusha, but before then it only has Kedusha of value, being from Trumas Alishka, so you could do Pidyon. So we would understand what's the difference between them in this point, whether it gets its Kedusha by Shechita or not. But Elala Abaye, however, according to Abaye, what's the difference between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon's opinion? Because according to Abaye and the second shot of Rashi, even Rebbe agrees that it already gets, that it does not, it does not get its Kedusha Sago fully at the time of the Shechita, and therefore the Pidyon still applies. There is a possibility of Pidyon up until the Zrika of the Dam. That's similar to Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, that it doesn't get its Kedusha until the Zrika Sadam, and therefore up until then it doesn't have the full Kedusha, and you could do Pidyon. So what is the practical difference between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, where Rebbe says it's Kaddish ve'ena Kaddish, and Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon says it's not Kaddish at all? But according to both of their opinions, it could still be deconsecrated up until the Zrikas Adam. And says the Gemara, the difference between them is these breads, if they left their place where they're supposed to be in, and they went out of that place, out of Yerushalayim, so then the question is, would it become puzzle? According to Rebbe, it gets Kedusha at the time of the Shechita, that now, if it leaves, it puzzles. However, according to Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, only at the time of the Zrikas Adam, it gets that status to be part of the carbon, that if it leaves, it would become puzzle. Right, only after the Zrika, but not after the Shechita. Okay, the Gemara now continues on this very subject, and it brings from another Amora that asks us as an Iboya. By Rab Shimon bar Rav Yitzchak, Rab Chia bar Abba, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, asks it as an Iboya from Rab Chia bar Abba. Kivsei Atzeres, the lambs on Shavuos, Sheshach on the Shmon, so the Shechita was done properly for the sake of the carbon, for the Shtei Alechem. V'zorak domon shaloi l'shma, and then the blood though was sprayed shaloi l'shma. This exact case that the Gemara was discussing before, that Rebbe said on this Kaddish ve'ena Kaddish, and Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon that said that it won't be Kaddish at all because the Zrika was done shaloi l'shma. So Rab Shmuel Rav Yitzchak asks about this case. Oisai halacha ma'o ba'achila. What's the halacha with this bread? Could the Kainim go ahead and eat from it? So the Gemara asks on this, according to everything we learned until here, it should be clear that there's no way that the Kainim can eat from this bread. Now, according to who, Rebbe or Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, is this Iboy being asked? Is that according to Rabbi Elazar b'Rab Shimon, the Amar Zrike Hide Mekacha, that it's only the Zrike of the blood for the sake of this bread that's Mekadesh it. So if so then it's clear, Ha'omar, again, that it's the Zrika of the blood that's Mekadesh it. So what does this mean? Since over here in this case the Zrika was done Shaloi L'Shma, so it did not get sanctified. So then what's the status of the Shtei Alechem? Does not have Kedushas Aguf. It still has its previous status of being just part of the ownership of the Trumas Alishka. That belongs to Hektish, and nobody has any right to have anor from it and eat from it. So for sure you can't eat from it. On the other hand, or if according to Rebbe's opinion that after the shechita it gets sanctified, and then if the zrika was done shaloi l'shma, so Rebbe used on this the expression of that it's kadosh and not kadosh, and we had the two interpretations before. So bein la'abaye, bein la'rove, according to both opinions, Abaye and Rove, kadosh, but ve'ein niter. It becomes sanctified, but if the zrika is done shaloi l'shma, it never got permitted to be eaten. Because by the shtei lechem, what is the permitter for it to be allowed to be eaten? Only after the zrika of the carbon is done properly, l'shma. So over here, the zrika was done shaloi l'shma. What would be the svara to say that you could eat from this bread? So says the Gemara, Elo alibe dahai tana. The shaila of Rav Shmuel Rav Yitzchak, we could explain, was according to the following Tana, and the Gemara here is going to bring a opinion of Rabbi Akiva that we could say, perhaps, that Rav Shmuel Rav Yitzchak's question was according to his opinion. The Tanya of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, the father of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, taught the following argument. Shtei alechem sheyotzu ben shchita lezrika. Shtei alechem that left its proper place, and when did that happen? Between the shchita of the lambs and the zrika of the blood. And then what happened was v'zorak damo shel kvasim chutz lezmana. The lambs, its blood was sprayed on the mizbeach with the intention that you will eat out of its time. This is pigul, right? That's the machshava of pigul when one does an aveda with the intention to eat or do the aveda or to burn on the mizbeach out of its time. So now the question is, this machshava of pigul, will that take effect on this bread that had left already before this zrika to have an effect on pigul on it? That if you would not eat from this bread, you would be chayav kares. As the halacha by pigul is, if you eat from a part of a carbon that pigul takes effect on it, one would be chayav kares. So Rabbi Eliezer says, Ein belechem mishum pigul. There's no status of pigul that takes effect on this bread that was taken out before the zrika of the dam. And then the zrika of the dam was done with this machshava of pigul, but the bread was already taken out. The machshava of pigul will not take effect. As the Gemara is going to explain in a moment what the reason for this is. Rabbi Akiva says, Yesh belechem mishum pigul. This bread was taken out. The zrika that was done with a machshava of pigul will be effective to make the status of pigul on this bread. Rav Sheshes explained the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva that Hani Tanoi Kirebi Sviruluhu. Both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva are following the opinion of Rebbe that we quoted before, the Amar Shchita Mekacha, that the Shtei Alechem becomes sanctified from the time of the Shchita. To be a full Kedushas Aguf, that's the time. Okay, so now Rabbi Eliezer. However, here Rabbi Eliezer follows his reasoning that he said, and this was actually also brought earlier in the Masechta, the Amar Ein Zrike Mo'eles Liyaitze, that the Zrike that's done here will not have any effect on this bread that went out. And the reason is because this bread that was already taken out before the Zrika was done, it became pasul. Since it was already sanctified at the Shechita, now it was taken out, so it became pasul. Once it became pasul, the status of pigul cannot take effect on it. This is the rule with pigul, that no status of pigul takes effect on something which is otherwise pasul. Pigul only takes effect in a carbon where everything else was done properly, and there's no other psul, then exclusively pigul takes effect. But over here, since the carbon is already, or the shtei alechem rather, is pasul, it was taken out, so pigul will not take effect. But Rabbi Akiva follows his reasoning, that the zrike will take effect even on something that is taken out, the sheikh lechem that was taken out and became pasul, but nevertheless, the zrika can have an effect on this. What's the reason? Because Rabbi Akiva says this idea that the machshava of pigul will not take effect if it's not the exclusive psul here, that's only if there's a psul in the body of the carbon itself, or in the avodah that's being done here. But over here, there's no intrinsic psul in the carbon itself, it's just the psul that it left its proper location. That's an external kind of a psul. So this kind of a psul is not a contradiction to the status of pigul taking effect on this bread that was taken out after the shechita. Now the Gemara brings the source of this machlekes of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, and we see here that this is a broader machlekes regarding this case. So the Tanan, as we learned this in the Mishnah, it says emure kachim kalim, the sacrificial parts of the kachim kalim. Now regarding kachim kalim, the halacha is that from the time that it was you were makdish the carbon, there is no isser of me'ilah, misusing it, that there would be all the halachas of me'ilah that would apply for misusing hektish. That halacha does not apply by kachim kalim until the time when the blood is sprayed on the mizbeach. When the blood is sprayed on the mizbeach, now there are sacrificial parts of the carbon that have to be brought and be burnt on the Mizbeach, it's from that point forward that the status of Me'ilah begins. But before then, before the Zrika of the Dam, the Kachim Kalam is considered to be Mamim Bailam. It's still the ownership, some level of status of ownership of the owner. Okay, so now over here, regarding these sacrificial parts of the Kachim Kalam Sheyatsu, they went out of their place that they're supposed to be. Lifnei Zrikas Damim, before the blood was sprayed. So Rabbi Eliezer says the blood that's now being sprayed for these sacrificial parts that were taken out, this new status that usually would take effect when you spray the blood, that now it would Me'ilah would apply. No, there is no din of Me'ilah. The Zrikas Adam for this which was taken out does not take effect at all. And and the dam that was sprayed for these emurim that were taken out, there's no pigul status either. As explained before, it's already possible, it was taken out, so there's no pigul status. And v'noisar, the chi of kadas for eating from noisar does not take effect either. And v'tame, when one is tame and he eats, those will not take effect here either. As the Gemara learns this out in Krisis, by noisar and tame as well, has to be exclusively the isser of noisar and tame. However, Rabbi Kiva says, that these sacrificial parts that were taken out, and now the blood is being sprayed for them, the status of Me'ilah will be effective. In other words, the Zrika, although it's being done for these sacrificial parts that were taken out, the Me'ilah will begin now, and the Chayavin Aleim Mishum Pigul, and the halacha of Pigul, if it was done with the Machshava of Pigul, will take effect as well, and also the Neisar V'Tami, and the Isurim and the Kadas of Neisar and Tami will take effect here as well. So now here we see, according to Rabbi Kiva, that even though, going back to the previous point that we mentioned regarding the Shtei Alechem, that in Rabbi Kiva's opinion, Rabbi Kiva says that the Shtei Alechem after the Shechita was taken out, but yet the Zrika that was done for this Shtei Alechem that was outside is effective for it. If it was a Zrika of Pigul, the status of Pigul will take effect on these breads that were taken out. So now the Gemara explains, based on this, that we could understand what Rab Shmuel ben Rabbi Yitzchak Sibaya was, that possibly that you would be allowed to eat from this Shtei Alechem as well. What's the svara here? So the Gemara explains. So according to Rabbi Kiva, what would be the halacha? What I say as follows: Midiz rikas pigul kova lelechem bepigul. Just like I see that Rabbi Kiva says that although these breads were taken out, but yet when you spray the blood and there was a machshava of pigul, that machshava of pigul is effective, and it will establish the bread to become pigul. B'yaitza, when it went out, and it's kibasar. This is the key point here, that even though the bread was taken out, but yet nevertheless, this bread still has the status, like the meat of the carbon that stayed inside. For sure, over there, the status of pigul takes effect. But we also say that the bread will have the same status like the meat which was left inside. So if that's the case, that I see over here, that Rabbi Kiva is saying that I compare the bread to the meat that was left inside, so maybe I could stretch this and say similar, that Zrike Shaloi Lishma, if you spray the blood for the Kifsei Atzeres, so you spray the blood Shaloi Lishma, and now the question is, what does that do for the Shtei Alechem? Will you not be allowed to eat from the Shtei Alechem? So maybe in Nami I should also say that Sha'yalei Lechem, that this Zrike Shaloi Lishma would be effective to allow to eat from this breads. What's the reason? Because, so Rashi explains, because of the svara of kibasar, that I see that according to Rabbi Kiva, I compare the Shtei Alechem to the basar. So over here, what I would say is, regarding the basar, what's the halacha when one does the zrika of Adam Shaloi Lishma on a carbon shlamim? So this is the first Mishnah in Masechtas Vachim that says that if you spray blood Shaloi Lishma on a carbon shlamim, then the carbon itself is kosher. The owner that may have brought it for his vow does not fulfill his obligation, but the carbon itself is kosher. So the basar with the zrika Shaloi Lishma is accepted then. It's mutter to bring the carbon, to eat from it. So maybe, according to Rabbi Kiva, just like I see that Rabbi Kiva says regarding the case of Yaitza when the Shtei Alechem went out, that I still say that the effect of the machshava of pigul on that Shtei Alechem will be similar to the basa which is inside. So maybe over here I should say regarding spraying blood of the Kifsei Atzeres Shaloi Lishma, just like that spraying of the blood takes effect for the basar itself, that it's the carbon itself is still kosher, so maybe it also takes effect for the Shtei Alechem, that you would be allowed to eat from the Shtei Alechem. Or perhaps the Gemara says, maybe this whole idea that Rabbi Kiva says is only stringently to say regarding the status of pigul, that what was taken out becomes pigul like the basar that's inside. So that's a chumrah. However, over here, for a kula, to be matir, to eat from the breads like the basar, when it was done shaloi lishma, maybe the breads are not on the same status of the basar, leniently to say that the zrika shaloi lishma would be matirit. So this was the way the Gemara is trying to justify and explain what Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Sibaya was. When the zrika is done shaloi lishma, that there would still be maybe a svara to say that you would be allowed to eat from the shtei alechem. But Rav Papa asks on this, that this opinion of Rabbi Akiva here could be interpreted completely different. Well, the whole machlekes here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva could be interpreted totally different, and it would not be a source of explaining what Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak's ibaya was. So Maskef Rav Papa asks, Sumi Mai, how do you know that the explanation of the machlekes of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer is the way it was explained before? And the case here is that the shtei alechem was taken out of its place between the shchita and the zrika, and that shtei alechem is still outside. And now the question is, does the shtei alechem get affected by the zrika, if it's pigul, like the basar? And therefore maybe we can learn from that the same would be regarding a zrika shaloi lishma. How do you know that's the case? Dilma, maybe the explanation of the argument between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, there's completely a different case. If the breads that was taken out is still outside, no one would argue that the zrika will not take effect for the breads that are outside. The argument here though is when that bread was brought back inside after it was taken out. The question is whether that it was taken out between the shchita and the zrika, does that create any psul or not? It was brought back in, but it was taken out between the shchita and the zrika. That's the question, does it create a psul? So now, if this is the case, then we could simply say that the argument here between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer is the same argument as Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar bar Rav Shimon that we had before. The Rabbi Eliezer Savarla Kerebi. Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is like Rebbe Dama Shchita Mekacha, that at the time of Shchita, these breads become fully sanctified, and therefore if these breads were taken out, then it was brought back in, but it got puzzled. Since it already became sanctified, it became puzzled, and therefore you can't, the machshava of pigul here will not take effect, because it already became puzzled. However, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Elazar bar Rav Shimon, Rabbi Akiva though holds like Rabbi Elazar bar Rav Shimon. The Omar Rabbi Elazar bar Rav Shimon says, Shchita loy mekacha, that the shchita does not sanctify these breads yet, and therefore v'lemifsali biyaitze, it does not become puzzle when it was taken out. It was taken out between the shchita and the zrika, and then it was brought back in. So because at the time of the shchita, it did not become sanctified. So when it went out, it wasn't sanctified yet, so it does not become puzzle. And therefore, the machshava of pigul later will have an effect. So according to this, we have no source at all to what the Gemara was trying to explain before for Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Sibaya. They're just arguing the exact same argument as Rebbe and Rav Elazar bar Rav Shimon. But the Gemara tries to reject this and says, "Hi, what's the strat that you're suggesting here? If you're going to say that Rabbi Akiva does hold like Rebbe, that at the time of Shchita, these breads did become sanctified. The Shchita was Mekadosh the bread. So now, then we could explain the case here, because we're talking about a case where the zrika was done with a machshava of pigul. Okay, so now we could explain as follows, that Rabbi Akiva is saying the katshiluhu b'shchita. At the time of the shchita, these breads became sanctified, like Rabbi's opinion. And then va'asiyah zrika kavalu b'pigul. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva says, at the time of the zrika, it's possible for the bread to have the status of pigul on it, even though it became pasul. But as explained before, that psul that doesn't stop the fact that pigul should take effect on it. So then it would make sense to say that this machshava of pigul would take effect. Now the Gemara explains though, however, if you're going to say that Rabbi Akiva is following Rabbi Elazar bar Rav Shimon's opinion, the Amma Zvicha loy mekacha, that these breads, at the time of the shchita, it did not become sanctified. So now zrikas pigul mi mekacha, at the time of the zrika, this was a zrika that was done with pigul. A zrika of pigul would sanctify these breads, and then you'll say that the status of pigul will take effect on these breads. What zrika, if according to Rabbi Elazar bar Rav Shimon, zrika has to sanctify breads, a zrika of pigul could do two things. It's going to sanctify the bread, and then also be mekadesh it, and then also have the status of pigul take effect on it, a pigul zrika will not accomplish this. As the Gemara here brings, Amar Rav Gidl Amar Rav. Rav Gidl said in the name of Rav, Zrikas pigul, when you have a zrika of pigul, it does not have this kind of effect. In a case where that's possible, it will not cause it now to attain the status of mila. And in a case where the effect of the zrika would be to take it out of its status of mila, that would not take effect either. Now the Gemara will explain, this is connected to the point that we learned here before. This is the basic difference regarding the halacha of meila between kachim kalin and kachim. Let's see, as the Gemara explains here. If it's done as a mizrika of pigul, it will not bring it to a status of meila. What does that mean? By the sacrificial parts of the kachim kalim, as I explained before, that until the zrika, there is no meila. It's only from the zrika forward that now the sacrificial parts have to be brought in the mizbeach. But Rav is saying that if it was done as a zrika's pigul, that's not going to change the status for meila to take effect. And ve'ena mitzia midei meila, that's v'basa kachim. Regarding kachim, the halacha is the opposite. That from the time that you will makdish the behema until the zrika, the status of meila is on this animal. From after zrika, it removes the status of meila for the basar that the kain can eat from it. But over here, since it was done with the zrika of pigul, it will not remove the status of pigul, or the status of meila rather. So this is the halacha that Rav said. So what do we see from this? We can't say that the case over here is that Rabbi Akiva holds like Rabbi Elazar but Rabbi Shimon that shchita did not sanctify the shtei alechem yet. So what is going to sanctify the shtei alechem in this case? The zrika. But the case that we're speaking about here is that the zrika was done with a machshava of pigul. And Rav said that cannot sanctify it at all. So how is Rabbi Akiva saying that the status of pigul takes effect on these breads? It's not even sanctified at all. So we must say that Rabbi Akiva is following Rebbe's opinion that the breads have become sanctified from the shechita according to Rebbe's opinion. So therefore that goes back to the point that the Gemara already made before, that this could be a source for the ibaya of Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. Okay, but however the Gemara concludes and says that no, this is not true because la v'toisef the Rav Gidl Amar Rav wasn't the words, the opinion of Rav Gidl Amar Rav refuted. The Gemara in Meila refutes this opinion. And therefore, we could say that the zrika of pigul is what sanctifies the bread. And therefore, the pshat that we said before for Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak is not necessarily true. So we don't really have a source to explain Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak's ibaya. Another shayla the Gemara says, "Boy minei Rav Yirmiyah Rav Zera." Rav Yirmiyah asks Rav Zera, "Kifsei atzeres sheshachta l'shman." The lambs of Shavuos that were shechted l'shma, but then what happened is v'avad alechem. The bread got lost. So we already learned before that once you have them together at the time of the shechita, they become bound together. And since they're bound together, if it gets lost afterwards, then it passes the carbon. It passes the kivsei atzeres. However, he still asked the shaila, Ma'u sheyizrik daman shaloi lishman. What would be the halacha? Could you not spray the blood of these kivsei atzeres, not for the sake of kivsei atzeres, but just for a plain shlamim? Lahater basav achila, and the point would then be that you could just bring it as a regular shlamim and then eat the meat. Amalei, so Reb Zera answers, how could this be? Yesh lecha davar, is there any carbon where we see such a thing? She'eina kosher l'shmai, that if the aveda is done for its sake, for l'shma, it would not be kosher, and for kosher shaloi l'shmai, and then if you would bring it shaloi l'shma, it would be kosher? So how are you suggesting here to say that because the breads got lost, so for the sake of kivsei atzeres it would be possible, but then if you would bring it shaloi l'shma, just as a plain shlamim, then it would be kosher? Where do we find such a thing? So the Gemara argues, "V'loi, do we not find such a thing? V'harei Pesach." But when it comes to the carbon Pesach, kaidem chatzais, before its time, that has to be brought on erev Pesach Yudalit after chatzais. So if it was shechted before the time, before chatzais, the eina kosher l'shmai. So here it's not kosher if it's brought l'shma, but a kosher shaloi l'shmai. But it is kosher if you bring the Pesach before its time shaloi l'shma. What happens? It gets a status of a shlamim. So I see by Pesach that there's such a thing that l'shma it's possible, but shaloi l'shma becomes a shlamim. So maybe I could say the same thing here. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Zera says, "Hachi ka'amina." This is what I was saying. Yesh lecha davar shenira l'shma. Do you have a carbon that was already there in the right timing when it has to be brought l'shma, and then minitchem l'shma, a psul happened and therefore got rejected from being brought l'shma. And ve'ena kosher l'shma, it's not kosher to be brought l'shma anymore. The kosher shaloi l'shma, and it would be kosher to be brought shaloi l'shma. So that we don't see by a Pesach. A Pesach after its time has to be brought only for a Pesach. But the Gemara asks further, no, but V'aloi, is this not true? V'harei Pesach, achaz manei, what's with the carbon Pesach after its time? If the carbon Pesach was not brought in Erev Pesach, then it's left later in the year. And then, B'shai Meis Hashana, in other days of the year. What happens then? If you bring it as a Shlomim, it'll be kosher. If you bring it as a Pesach, it won't be. But then in the rest of the year, if you take that carbon Pesach that was left over, you could bring it then as a Shlomim. So here I see a carbon that was in its right time. It got rejected because it wasn't brought then. And then it's brought later as a Shlomim. So I could say the same thing here, that it should be brought as a Shlomim. So again, Rav Zera clarifies, Hachi ka'amina. This is what I was saying. Yesh l'chad davar. Do you have a carbon? Shenira l'shmai. It was there, and it was in the time to be brought l'shma. And v'nishchat l'shmai. It was already shechted for the sake of this carbon. And then v'nitchem l'shmai. And then a psul happens, and it was rejected from being brought l'shma. And ve'eina kosher l'shma, and therefore now it won't be kosher anymore to be brought, that you should do this rika, you should continue the aveda l'shma. And the kosher shalai l'shma, and now it would be kosher to continue and do it shalai l'shma. So how are you suggesting here that it became puzzle because the shtei alechem got lost, and now you're just going to bring it as a shlomim, shalai l'shma, for what it was really intended to be, and it should be kosher just for that? So the Gemara asks on this, and this is actually a case that we had on the previous daf. V'loi, do we not find this? V'harei toida. This is exactly what the halach is by a toida. As the Gemara brought in the previous daf, when you have the toida with the breads, if the breads become disqualified, and the Gemara there brought various cases where the breads become disqualified, so then you can continue doing the avodah with the toida. It won't be a toida, but it'll be a shlamim. So you see, it's not kosher l'shma for the toida, but it'll be a shlamim. So maybe I should say the same thing here. That says the Gemara. As the Gemara explained this already in the previous daf, Taida is different because there's a pasuk where it says Shani Taida the Rachmana Kari Shlamim. By the carbon Taida, there's a clear pasuk that says that it's not only a Taida, but it's also a Shlamim. It says in the pasuk Zevach Taidas Shlamav. So since it also has the status of a Shlamim, when it can't be used as a Taida, then you could shecht it for a Shlamim. But over here, regarding the Kifsi Atzeres, once you lose the breads and it can't be brought anymore as Kifsi Atzeres, so then you can't use it at all anymore, shecht it for a Shlamim to eat the breads from it.